Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little. I'm here today with episode 191 of Weekly Poker Hand. I want to thank all of you for being here today. Today we get pocket queens in a tournament. Notice the blinds are 2,500, 5,000, and we have 300,000 chips. 300,000 chips is usually a lot, but it's only 60 big blinds here. So I do open it up to 12,000 from early position with the pocket queens, which is clearly great. And a kid who has the same stack as me decides to call in the big blind. All right. Flop comes 8-7-5. Now, this is a spot where quite often you should be very cautious when it comes to continuation betting. And the reason is because my opponent should have way more nut hands than I should have. If you think about my range, I should have kind of at best pocket 8s and 7s. I'm probably not even opening 6s and 5s from early position. I'm certainly not opening 8-7 offsuit, right? Whereas my opponent may be defending with that. Also, my opponent certainly has 8, 7s, and 5s in his range, as well as perhaps 9, 6, and 6-4, especially suited. So this is a spot where, while I will often have a range advantage, a little one, I do not have a polarization advantage, meaning I don't have nearly as many hands that can confidently apply a lot of pressure. Now, some people think, oh, pocket queens, that's an overpair, that's great. And while this is a pretty great hand, if I get check raised in this spot and my opponent bets the turn and jams the river, I'm in a pretty bad spot, right? Given this is one of the best hands I can have, but at the same time, it loses very easily to all of my opponent's decently strong hands. So, for that reason, I think this is a reasonable spot to check behind. If there was a flush draw on the board, I would probably still just check behind. I realize that by checking, you sometimes get outdrawn by a hand that would just fold to a bet, like ace-3 or something like that. Also, you do let the draws draw for free, but remember, you don't know what your opponent has. And when he does have me beat, it is absolutely horrible to bet the flop and then end up playing for all the money. So by checking back the flop, you allow yourself to very easily call the turn and then call the river on most clean runouts. There are certainly spots where, say, the turn's a 6 and your opponent bets the turn and bets the river, you should probably fold. But for the most part, we are looking to see a showdown. So I'm just going to check it back here. So it does go check, check on the flop. Turns a queen, which is, hello, that's great. My opponent checks, and now I'm definitely going to bet for value. When my opponent checks twice, most of the time he's going to have a hand worse than a queen. We're looking at mostly pocket jacks and worse. And against that somewhat weak range, I think we need to just make a reasonable but somewhat small bet. Here I do bet 16,000. If the turn put up a backdoor flush draw, or if, let's say, instead I had pocket 10s and the turn was a 10, giving a few more obvious, or making a few more obvious draws available, I would bet bigger. But this queen really is just awful for my opponent. And whenever the turn card is awful for your opponent, but pretty good for you, you should very often bet on the smaller side. That said, we are still pretty deep, so you can... a small bet when you're deep is something like half pot, whereas a small bet when you're very shallow, like 20 big blinds deep, may be a third pot. So anyway, here I do go right at about a half pot, and I like this. I could certainly see merit for betting big. That will allow me to bluff with a lot of my unpaired hands, which could be nice if I can make my opponent fold out pairs. But I go for a small bet. And the opponent calls. If he raised here, I would just call. I am still actually somewhat concerned about the various straights that are available. Not that I'm going to ever fold, but I'm not trying to just blast all my money in. Now, if you're playing against someone who will view a hand like ace-8 or ace-queen as the nuts and will check raise the turn and then just never assume that they're beat, then sure, go ahead and get your money in with your queens. But against most competent players, they realize that they don't need to be check raising the turn here a ton. Okay, so I bet 16,000 on the turn and my opponent calls. River's a jack of hearts, putting up the 10-9 straight. So another one of the cards that I didn't, well, one of the cards I didn't exactly want to see. But if you think about it, a jack, 10, 9, 6, or 4 are all potentially bad. And again, you don't really know which one is bad. So the question is now, can I value bet this? And I think the answer is definitely yes. If we are going to value bet, we want to ask, what are we trying to get called by? Well, normally you're trying to get called by top pair type hands, but I have that blocked pretty nicely. So instead, I'm trying to get called by medium pairs like pocket 9s or ace-8. And I don't think those hands are going to call a very large bet unless we have some sort of leveling dynamic with our opponent. If our opponent thinks we're going to use big bet sizes to try to bully him out of the pot, then I'm all for betting very big here, like pot or maybe even more. If my opponent doesn't really have any thoughts about what I'm doing, and it's just instead going to assume that big bets mean big hands, then I think we should lean more towards betting small, because we are trying to get called by an 8 here a lot of the time, or a hand like an 8 or a 7. So let's see what I do. If I was playing this hand right now, I would go pretty small, like 20,000, and this time I did go 22,000. And I think that's just going to be a good size, targeting our opponent's very obviously weak range. And some people may say, yeah, the small bet screams you're trying to get called. And while it may, I am still going to bluff here with the size some portion of the time. Not a ton, and whenever you are betting very small, you don't need to have very many bluffs in your range. But you don't want to get in the habit of using small bet sizes only when you're going for value and big bet sizes when you're polarized, because then your small bets should effectively never get called, right? Unless your opponent is oblivious to what you're doing. So make sure you have bluffs in your range, especially when you're playing against presumably decent kids. So I do go 22,000. Let's see if we get looked up. We do. So we're clearly going to win when he just calls, because everyone raises with all the straights. And we win a nice little pot. This hand is... It may look like we lost value or left value on the table, because a lot of people think, oh, you should just bet the flop. You could have then bet the turn and then bet the river. But remember, we didn't know a set was going to come. And also, by playing the hand in this way, we pretty much made it impossible to go broke on this hand. Yes, we get outdrawn some portion of the time, but in exchange for that, we are certainly going to get to see more hands. And if you think you have an edge in a tournament, quite often the most valuable thing you can do is make sure you get to see more hands, because every hand you're dealt, you have an edge. And if you somehow go broke on this hand, you don't get to realize your edge anymore. It's just gone. So that's going to be it for this hand, for this episode of Weekly Poker Hand. If you have not already, make sure you check out pokercoaching.com. We recently released a bonus program where now whenever you play the quizzes there, you get bonus credits, which you can use to redeem for various other Jonathan Little products. So check that out. You can sign up for a completely free trial for 1 week at pokercoaching.com. You really have no reason not to, unless you're lazy. And if you've listened to 191 episodes of this podcast, you're probably not so lazy. So check it out, pokercoaching.com, and be sure to check back next week for another fun poker hand. Good luck in your games.